Well, here to explain more about this discovery is the ABC News Online science editor, Darren Osborne. Darren Osborne, welcome. The discovery of water on the moon, why do we care?
Well, if we ever send astronauts to the moon, and that could be a long time away from now, we need water to help them survive, because if there's no water on the moon, that means we have to truck it in all the time, and that can be very expensive.
Well, not quite literally truck it in,
but using spacecraft, yeah. And the other advantage too is with water we can split it up into its components of oxygen and hydrogen, so we can keep astronauts alive with the oxygen. We can use the hydrogen as a fuel as well.
Well, we'll have a look at how much they found in a moment. But first of all, the way this discovery was made, we just mentioned there, it was basically the crashing of spacecraft, but can you give us some more insight?
Yeah, well, in the middle of last year, NASA launched two spacecraft called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, and this one called LCROSS, which stands for the Lunar Crater Observation and Sensing Satellite, hence why they shorten it down. The latter one, what it did is it was purposely directed to crash into the moon, and it did it in two stages. It used the rocket that helped it get to the moon, and that went first, and it impacted into a crater that was near the South Pole. And then what it did is it watched that impact and saw what was coming up in that sort of explosion of lunar dust. It then 3 minutes later also impacted into the moon. Now at the same time all this was happening, we had astronomers here on Earth watching the explosion, trying to see what would come up there, and also that Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which went up at the same time. It was orbiting the moon and it got to watch it from another perspective.
And the particular crater they crashed into, that was chosen, wasn't it, because it was very deep, very dark, and they thought if there was any ice, that's where it would be?
Exactly, yeah. It's located near the South Pole, so it doesn't get any light at all from the moon because it is deep into the surface, and being at the poles, the sun is at a very shallow angle. So they were hoping that if there is any ice that is on the surface of the moon, because it doesn't get warmed up by the sun's light, it would be there.
Well, water, they found water, but how much did they find? I mean, water ice versus water in quantity.
Well, what happened is when the spacecraft hit, or both of them hit, they came in at about 8,500 kilometres per hour.
As you do.
Yep, no breaks at all. And what that caused is a 30-metre crater that blew up a vast volume of dust. And in that dust, they found about 155 kilograms of water ice. Now, that doesn't sound like a huge amount, but when they did their calculations, but looking at the volume of the plume and that amount, they found that it equates to about 5% of the material that blew up contained water ice, and that's much higher than the 1% threshold that NASA were hoping to find, because if there's more than 1% water ice in the soil, that means they could use it if they ever send astronauts there.
And does it mean that there's water elsewhere on the moon? I mean, they were very deep in a crater, as we said.
Look, not around most of the moon. We're talking probably only around the polar regions, the North Pole and the South Pole, because it has to be in those shaded areas. So we're not likely to find it around what we call the equatorial regions of the moon, where a lot of the Apollo missions landed back in the 60s and 70s. So if we were to extract that water, we would have to send missions to those poles.
And to use that water for explorers, you don't just boil a billy, I'm assuming. What would you have to do?
Well, because the volume is so much, it could almost be as simple as that, because scientists were saying if it was below that 1% threshold, then there'd have to be a lot of chemical processes that would go about. But with such an amount that they found, you could essentially just put it into a chamber and evaporate out that water ice and then collect it. So, I mean, it wouldn't be as simple as boiling a billy, but certainly much easier than had there been less.
They also found other things, didn't they? They found mercury and they found methane. What else did they find?
Well, two of the surprising things was silver and, as you said, mercury. Now, the scientists think gives them a bit of an indication as where the water might have come from, because previous studies have shown that comets, for example, contain mercury and silver as well, and they also contain water ice. So it could be that the water had come from comets that crashed into the moon very early on in the moon's formation, and they have been preserved there. So even though they might have crashed all over the moon, those other areas that were in sunlight, the water would have evaporated, but in these craters themselves, the water has stayed in there.
So those other things that they've found, can they be used in any way? Could they be used for fuel?
Certainly, there's potential for all sorts of applications. I mean, they could be used as building materials as well, if there are any sort of metallic substances in there, as we say, like mercury. It also presents a bit of a hazard, though, because we do know that mercury is a substance that you don't want to play around with, so to speak. But certainly with silver, there's a lot of benefits from that, not just from the exploration point of view, but maybe from a monetary perspective as well. So there could be some mining companies out there that take interest in these results.
That said, that this research is being done, I understood that the Obama administration had actually said no more spending on expeditions to the moon. Is that right?
Yeah, that certainly seems to be the case. When President Obama earlier this year sort of outlined his plan for NASA, he seemed to suggest that the Constellation program, which is the replacement to the space shuttle that would help America get to the moon, that seems to have been cancelled. There hasn't been any rubber stamp on that as far as I'm aware. But the Chinese are certainly interested in the moon, and they see that as their next step. They've already launched 6 astronauts over the last few years there. They have a spacecraft that's currently on its way to the moon, and they're planning on a lander.
That's an unmanned spacecraft,
unmanned
though.
one, yep. So they're looking at an unmanned lander as well in 2012, and they sort of have this forward projection of maybe in the 2020s, 2030 of sending astronauts to the moon. So there's certainly interest, but also scientists are interested in understanding what's on the moon because they want to understand how the solar system formed and where we've all come from.
Darren Osborne, many thanks.
Thanks.
Well, Darren Osborne there from our science unit.